Good evening, everyone. Buenas noches a todos y todas. My name is Yuri Doku. I'm the Assistant Director of OLLAS. Thank you again for joining us tonight. We are very pleased to present our second artist talk as part of our ArteLatinX. Our guest speaker is Nancy Friedemann-Sánchez, a Colombian-American contemporary artist. Nancy Friedemann has a master's degree from University, a BFA from Artist Art Institute, and undergraduate studies from la Universidad de los Andes in Bogotá, Colombia. She has been awarded for numerous grants and awards, such as the Catherine Doctor of Prize in Painting and Nebraska Arts Council Achievement Award, a Smithsonian Artist Fellowship, among others. Currently, Nancy is creating a visual novel comprised of paintings, sculptures, and mixed media that together and in different voices wave a synchronicity of dialogue, passages, punctuations, and silences about hybridity and cultural ownership. It is a multi-narrative novel about cultural memory, migration, and the pursuit of the American dream. Her work is anchored in the histories of the encounter between the Americas and the Europe. The outcomes are then intertwined, intersecting to make narratives that describe lives of spiritual and physical transit. Having grew up in Colombia and having migrated to the US, as an adult, she makes art in two languages, about the curious and intense experience of physically having moved, yet having a piece of herself remaining rooted in Colombia. Nancy Friedemann creates visual expression about the hybridity and syncretism that has taken place since the conquest of the Americas and that gets replicated in the migration experience. Please welcome Nancy.
I should turn off my phone. Hi. Wait a second, how do I move this?
You can just press any button, the space bar. There you go.
Okay, great. Well, it's great to be here. Thank you very much for having me. When I do talks, I kind of tailor them for the audience, the moment, what kind of place I'm in, and because it's OLLAS and because I think that this is so much about identity, I'm going to start with kind of like my early origins. I was born in Bogotá, Colombia, and my father is American, North American. He is from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. His mother was born in Scotland, and she arrived here at 11 years old. So she was an economic migrant. My grandfather came from Russia, from my dad's side, and probably came escaping the pogroms, and probably also for economic reasons. From my mother's side, it's a mixture, longer in the Americas, longer in Colombia, Spanish, indigenous, Jewish, and it goes back hundreds of years. This is a picture of Bogotá. We're very different from Nebraska. Downtown Bogotá. So I grew up speaking English and Spanish, both at the same time, all the way from birth, because my dad was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So ever since I was a child, I've been journeying back and forth between English and Spanish. Spanglish is so common to me, it goes all the way back to my childhood. And I'm showing you this piece. This is one of the first pieces that I made as a child. And I'm showing it to you because I think here lies the kind of the need, the emotional need that I understood as a little kid, that I wanted to be an artist. And when I made these, and I made probably many of these, making them would always take me to kind of like a place of suspension. That kind of thing where you say, you know, I'm in the zone, I'm in a groove. And I lost this piece, and around 1998, my mom was on her deathbed, literally, and she says to me, Nancy, where is that piece? You've got to save that piece because that piece is important for your work. And I found it 7 years after. And of course I framed it. But I always think that that is at the core of why I became an artist. So I didn't become an artist to talk about the encounter between the Americas and Europe or anything like that. I became an artist because it was a very deep need to have kind of like that place that, you know, that gives you butterflies, that sends you in a zone. And I think that's important. This is my dad in his house. So these are, if you see in the back, there's a painting of a cat on a rug. So I went to Universidad de los Andes for 2.5 years, and then my dad, who is from the US, said, you should go to the US. We have family there, go and study there. And so I went to LA and I graduated from Otis. And when I went back to Bogota, with a whole training in theory, and I studied with Mike Kelly and with all of these like very important LA artists. And I went back home to the house of my parents, because where else? If I'm going back to Colombia, that's the only possibility. So I go there and I'm thinking, what am I going to paint? So we had a cat that we loved, and my family was an upper middle class family. And so I decided to paint what was, to me, the closest, the most honest that I thought could represent where I was. And I also had the need that I really wanted to learn how to paint. So that painting there is one that survived of that era, and it's still in my dad's apartment. And this is a recent photo. Now this is, I moved to New York in 1991, and I went to NYU, and this is one of the first pieces that I did. I think you can see a relationship to that first piece. It's inspired in, when I moved to New York, I took a couple of crochet doilies that my grandmother made. And back in LA, I had become very interested in the feminist movement, in the pattern and decoration movement, in the works of Judy Chicago, of Miriam Shapiro, and all of these women that were so important and that worked in LA, in CalArts, and that were really kind of moving art forward. And I stayed interested in that. And I didn't feel that when I arrived in Bogota that had a place to really kind of grow. And it started happening when I moved to New York. So this is a work during school. All of the underpainting is writing, and it's writing of boleros, of like really romantic songs. And then all of these are, it's the doily, which if you think of it as it's a geometric system, amplified, turned into a kind of concert of constellations of words, of each one is a stitch, each one is a mark. So you can see like one, almost like if I was stitching via crocheting with a brush. But I was, of course, absorbing New York and learning about New York and learning about the New York School and looking at the works of the grand patriarchs of American art, Jackson Pollock. I was really wanting to understand that, understand the culture, understand the place where I was. So still, I'm not thinking about, I think, you know, the ideas of Spanish started coming in here. I started translating poems from English to Spanish. Here again is the doily. This is a 12-foot piece. It's a drawing on mylar. So I took it, I pared it down to drawing, to using a marker on vellum. And it's all writing. I'll move quickly through these. But it's the structure of the doily turned into writing. In English, in Spanish, translations of texts, automatic writing, clusters and I would work in silence. This was all silent work. And it was the idea of mapping memory. So this is when I started thinking about cultural memory. So in some way I had brought in feminism, I had brought in women's work, I had brought in women's art influences and women artists. And some of these I did, this I did at Bemis. I was doing a residency there in 2001. So I didn't turn this into text, but it was thinking of the landscape. And the idea of repetition. These again, this is all text. These are slides turned into, so you can see that they have aged. They're a little yellow. And it's all marker. This is all writing. Then one of these, this is called fingerprints. These are large pieces. So this is about like 7 feet by 4, something like that. And one is in English and the other one is in Spanish. So they were verbs. What do I think about in Spanish related to Colombia? What do I think about in English related to the US? And again, it's thinking of, I'm thinking about the art of the US, of my new home. This is self-portrait as dragon. So here I'm beginning to think about me as other, dragon, outsider, and it's all writing. This is kind of almost like a body, like a torso. It's all writing. Then I did some that were kind of like vertebrae, and they were sculptures, again with writing. And then these are, this was a really beautiful piece. It was all writing, all stream of consciousness. And it's a really large piece. It's like 7 feet tall, and then multiply that in panels. Then they started becoming really minimal. These are, I did these porcelain spheres, and each one had text. Some of it was biographical. And then I installed them on a wall as a sculptural drawing. But the work then was very minimal. This was at the Queen's Museum, and this was a 60-foot wall. And this is when I started bringing in imagery from Colombia. This is a typical poporo, which is a pre-Columbian vessel for the consumption, the ritual consumption of coca. And the Queen's Museum is in a neighborhood that is very Colombian, where I could see that everybody could recognize this image. And it had a whole translation of a Colombian essayist, of a piece of writing. And then I did a residency in London at a place called Gasworks. And I started looking at lace, and I started visiting, it was a summer of visiting museums, visiting the British Museum, all of these amazing museums that had all the Victoria and Albert. And I started looking at the collections of lace of the Victoria and Albert and all of the women's work and thinking about what those traditions mean historically and what has been the place of women in history, in art history. This again is and I started looking at the curtains that many people in London have, and it kind of reminded me, it just felt to me that they had a whole social meaning, a whole idea about status and place. This is called Byzantine Bread, and again, I was thinking of artists like Agnes Martin, but using each one of these is like this big, and they're curtains that are traced, and this piece is really large. It like goes like from here to like the end of the room, and it's all India ink on paper. This is called, and of course I did it for pleasure. So again, ideas about pleasure, where pleasure fits in the feminine, in society. Where does the pleasure of women fit in society? And this title, I was installing this in Bogota in a gallery, and it really annoyed the owner of the gallery. The title itself. The title annoyed him. It was like the relationship was over. I've thought about it quite a bit, like, wow, okay. And that's a very large scale piece. So one of the things that has been a common idea throughout the work is that I basically take these works that supposedly in history have meant to stay small, private, from the domestic sphere. They don't take place in the public sphere. And what I do is I give them a place of honor, and I give them a place of enormity. They become kind of heroic. Each one is made with a tiny little stroke, and that it just accumulated. It's like that voice accumulated. It's like, I am here. They are supposed to take space. And then I started working with flowers, and this was the turn of going to Colombia, and to Colombia's history. So, but these things take a long time. It's, meaning and when is it that you're going to start working on your history, your own personal history? I wish I had done it when I was in my 20s, but it just took a long time to filter and to exist here in this bicultural, bilingual place, to be able to start thinking about the history of Colombia and the history of that relationship of South and North America, of Colombia and Europe, of the colony here, of the colony there. And that's kind of what obsesses me now. So these flowers are inspired in the Colonial Botanical expedition that occurred in all of the Americas. First, the British started here very early on with Mark Catesby and all of the accounts of the Carolinas. It was not only that, it was taking flora and fauna back to England and creating cabinets of curiosities and trying to plant magnolias in England and things like that. And then in a place like Colombia, they were criticized. Suddenly the British were criticizing the Spanish crown because they were just extracting the gold and killing the natives, and et cetera, et cetera. So, and they were forced to start a botanical expedition. So they sent, and this also, Humboldt has some place in it, but they sent a priest who started recording the flora from Colombia. And so this is inspired in the botanical expedition. And poems like a Boyma from Violeta Parra, thinking of colonization. Should I translate it? Why? No lloro por llorar, mi llorar es como un ruego que nadie quiere escuchar. The que nadie, it's very folksy, it's written in like a folk language. Que nadie quiere escuchar, del ver y considerar la triste calamidad que vive la humanidad en toda su longitud. La escasez de virtud es lo que me hace llorar. And then I say, tomado de Violeta Parra, I don't cry for crying, my cry is like a plea that no one will listen to see and consider the sad calamity that humanity lives in all its longitude. The scarcity of virtue is what makes me cry. So I placed that there, thinking also of the kind of response that it would get in North America, knowing that it would be seen as utterly sentimental, a little bit telenovela. And it was a little bit of I thought of it as a place, a pointed place where cultures clash, where I clashed in the cultures, back and forth. And I grew up in the 70s listening to the poems of Violeta Parra, of Silvio Rodriguez, of all of these protest political songwriters that kind of pervaded through all of Latin America. I mean, people would just, Mercedes Sosa, I mean, this was a... Now this is another piece, still thinking of lace, but thinking of landscape. So these are little detours. This is a very large piece. And the lace, kind of like the lace becomes taken apart. So I've done things where I've kind of take the lace and just copy it exactly, almost as an exercise of copying, almost like how do you learn? By imitating, by copying the culture. How do you learn another language? And this is kind of like taking it apart. So the lace becomes landscape, kind of becomes an underwater space. And it's winter. It's a winter space. There's no winter in Bogota. This I called Fogwet Night, the Rottweiler's Tide, and it's inspired in colonial painting, in Spanish colonial painting. And again, it's the lace taken apart. It's a large piece. This is about 9 feet. It's 9 feet tall. It's made with enamel on mylar. So all of the work I'm able to roll it up and carry it. A lot of my work is made that way. It's kind of thinking, my idea behind it is you have to be able to make your work with money or no money. If this was made with a canvas, this would be a $2,000 canvas, between the stretcher and the canvas. And if I wanted to send it to any shows, the crate would be another $1,500, and the shipping another $500. So a way that I have devised to be able to make my work and ship it back and forth to here, to there, where I can accept exhibitions is and which is also the idea of the traveler. You migrate. Well, how do you migrate? You migrate with a suitcase. And I arrived in New York with a suitcase. And $700. I don't know how I did it. Detail of that. So I'm playing with nature, with the Botanical expedition, landscape of La Sabana de Bogotá. And it's inspired in a in a piece of land that my parents had. And I mentioned in the beginning that I come from an upper middle class background, but upper middle class in Latin America is very different to upper middle class here. Upper middle class here is a lot more affluent than upper middle class there. And so I would say that I am also an economic migrant. When I came to the US, it was right after Paulo Escobar, which was kind of like a Donald Trump, was taking over the country. He wanted to be president, and thank God he was not able to be president, but he created so much damage from the outside. Eroded the institutions, would kidnap judges, kill judges, police, military, etc. And that trickled down to society, and so people that were started to using tactics of the narcos in order to survive. So my parents had this little farm, not a big farm, not hacendados, a little farm outside of the city, and all of these things happened where suddenly my dad was accused of this and that, and the neighbors who had a lot of money would let the Rottweilers out at night and kill the cats that my parents had, and these are the different world problems. So this is why I call it Fogwet Night, the Rottweilers' time. I'm thinking of the beauty of the landscape, the potential violence, and well, the love of home. Another piece. Can I go a little faster? How am I doing with time? Okay. This is called I Love You with the Syllables I Know, which is inspired in motherhood. I was becoming a mother. So it's a large scale piece inspired in minimalism. So here's some of the big themes that appear. I always think of my large scale pieces. They're always resting in the backdrop of patriarchy, of minimalism, of large scale male painting. That is what I consider dominant in this country. This is what you go to see at the Museum of Modern Art. And I'm placing in front a drama of feminine gestures, of motherhood, of nests, of sentimentality. All the no-nos. And I like to play with the no-nos. I like to play with the elements that supposedly have no status. Women's work, butterflies. And this is a commission I did. This is a little bit outside of the let's say regular museum or academic practice. So I was invited to do a piece for a ship, and I said yes, of course. So this is at a room that it's on deck 5 of a Celebrity Cruises ship, and it was fabulous. So it's all of the drawing of lace with birds from the Botanical expedition, and then I did the panels, and they said, well, what about if you design a floor? And I said, sure, why not? So this is Italian granite. I just gave them a drawing, and they sent it to Italy, and these are all kind of like, this is sandblasted. And then they took it there, and then they said, okay, well, now you have to go where the ship is getting finished in Eemshaven in Holland, and go and finish it, because we want you to do the ceiling. And I went there, and I worked for 10 days on a scaffold while they were finishing the ship. It was incredible. It's the only time I've been on a cruise ship. So, and then I designed the moon. I went back to New York, and then the CEO of the ship came and said, well, you know, an installation, the CEOs, an installation needs a sculptural piece. So the gallery that I was working with said, well, I have a connection to La Ligue. How about if you design something and La Ligue will make it? It's like, okay. And so, so again, it kind of happened, and then they said, this is super successful. I talked with there are 54 nationalities in these cruise ships around, everybody, and it replicates society in a pathetic way, let's say. The captain is German, the people that do laundry are Chinese, and so forth and so forth. So I was there talking with everybody and living in this place, which is actually very arid and very artificial. So I went back to New York and I worked with a sound engineer and a composer, and I made created sound with them. So there's music that has wind, bugs, birds. So when you go in there, all you're listening. And of course I was thinking of Florida, where I had started the piece, and then the North Sea, and just the combination, it turned out very well. Another image of that. The moon. Inspired in Audubon, Catesby. And this is a show that followed in New York. I'm going to go quickly through these because I want to spend time in. So this is a development of that. But I think with that, you can see how a practice can, you take it in one way. It's like a tree with branches, and you go through this branch, and you kind of end up on that branch for a while, even though you have other ideas that are over here. So this show is kind of like that continuation of that branch. And here I'm looking at inspiring myself in bunting birds, which are migratory birds. And I used a little Spanish colonial painting trope with the little things that says, "You want the taco?"
That's funny. Sweet.
It's the idea that all Latins, all love tacos. So it's a little other. And this is when I moved to Nebraska. And when I moved here, it was really kind of dramatic after living in New York and going to Lincoln. So I spent a year thrift shopping, reading, depressed. You can imagine, right? So, and I started working slowly and reading. I read a novel by Roberto Bolaños, and it was like, oh, this is incomprehensible. Has 40 characters. But it was like, wow, 40 characters, 40 voices, have so many narratives in your head. Again, it's like the tree with all of these branches, and I've been going down this branch for a long time. So I thought, well, if I was a writer, what is it that I've done up till now? And I thought, well, maybe poems, essays, short stories. And I thought, well, what do people do when they hit a certain age and they're in a certain place or have a certain aspiration? I thought, well, I'm gonna do my novel, my great American novel. So I called it a visual novel. And this is where I am. And so I had, right before moving here, I had done a fellowship at the Smithsonian, and I had looked at hundreds of samples of lace made by Europeans that brought it here, Americans that made it here, and I just read all of these great histories. And one that I was telling Alec a few minutes ago was that during the Revolutionary War, I mean, and this all has to do again with what is the place of women in the world, where women couldn't work in the public space, but they could work at home, and they would make lace, and they would make lace based on the pieces of parchment, of leather, that had little pokes that defined what a pattern would be like. And so women, during the war, when the men were not there, they were out fighting, they would take from the smallest child to the oldest woman in the house, and they would make lace, and that lace became their form of economy. And so I went back to, again, to the root of the intricate pattern of the woman's work, of that. And again, I was at home, I was making a home, decorating, moving from an apartment to a house, figuring out how to fill up a room. You had no furniture, so thinking of the domestic space, and thinking of having left, of having moved into America, into deeper America, because New York is a place that is very international. I mean, you can be there with crossing the street with people from many places in the world. And so I started making, again, these pieces that alluded to minimalism, to patriarchy, using a feminine imagery, working very slowly, and this is all made with a tiny little brush on metal. And it's all inspired in the lace that I photographed, investigated, read about at the Smithsonian. And this little bird is a bird out of the colonial drawings. And this was a moment, a teaching moment, because everything is, I mean, you have the content, but you also have your formal troubles. So I was like, how am I going to make this to fit, to match all that drawing? And the way that I figured how to shade it was with line. So it's all with line, tiny little lines. So it's almost like if it was a lace piece. For me, it was a brilliant moment. It was an aha, like, wow, this is how you do this. I haven't done it again. Yeah, because sometimes you reach something and you're like, so scary. Because it was just line, line. And then, chapter 1, studio in Lincoln, big studio compared to New York studio. And I started making all kinds of works, all kinds. Pots inspired in pre-Columbian urns. This piece here is a piece made, it's like a lace piece, but made with freshwater pearls. And I put a light in there, and it has like a, kind of like an umbilical cord. Then these are inspired in the crisoles, which are, I'm really now looking at the history. The farther I'm away from Colombia, the more I'm looking to that history now. So these are inspired in the crisoles, which were the objects that were created to melt the gold. And those practices that were from the native Colombians were taken over by the Afro-Colombians, the Africans that started living in the same regions, and started influencing each other culturally. So they're inspired in those. And why did I start working on those? Well, my mother was an anthropologist. who moved to the US as an economic migrant, studied a little bit here, met my dad, who was from Pittsburgh, and decided that she was going to live in Colombia, and went back and graduated there and became an anthropologist. So I spent my childhood vacations going with her to the places where she was doing field work. And I went to Palenque, San Basilio, which is a Maroon community. That means a community of escaped slaves that still exist till today. So those histories of what is still there that goes all the way back to either before the Spanish arrived or after or in that transition, that really interests me. And I started really digging into how personally I connected to that. So this is inspired in the times when I was in my mom's office. I had free reign of all the museum that was not available to the public, and I would go up and down and look at the cabinets and all of that. So it's there as part of my own personal and cultural memory. This piece is a piece of wood from the Platte River, and a little carving, anonymous carving that I found in my thrift shopping expeditions, and I placed it on so it's a sculpture that sticks out from a minimalist panel. So some pieces are, reflections on the historical, others are personal. Thinking of the anonymous gestures of artisans. This is inspired in chumbis, the indigenous textiles from the Guambiano, and placed on structures that might remind you of minimalist sculpture of works like, I can't remember his name, is it Dan Brown? John McCracken, yes. Here's the lace, and the lace becomes a flood. So thinking of art history, occurrences of life, and these are drawings of lace, and these are very large. They are 135 by 270 inches. And again, it's tiny little marks, and the lace becomes a landscape, and a landscape of disaster. And this is installed in Germany. This is called oil spill. And the reason why I folded the paper like this is 135 by 315 inches. I folded it thinking of my new home and the home of quilting. It's ancestral, one of its ancestors, ancestral tradition. So it's folded like a quilt. Again, thinking of the 40 voices. This piece is called, the two of them together are called Travelers and Settlers. So I made a wall of metal painted with car paint, and then a table that, so here it is. It's Dibond painted with, and these are freshwater pearls that I kind of made into sculptural shapes, kind of like nests. And that's another piece, but thinking of the pedestal as a work of art. Again, another object from the bird is like an artisan anonymous, and the piece is called Anonymous. And this is the installation view. The iron is an iron that belonged to my grandmother and probably belonged to her mother. So in all my trips to Colombia, that happened every year. I'm always bringing something. Whatever I can bring in a suitcase. So the iron, what else is there? A little pre-Columbian figure. So this piece is a little bit about history, about a trajectory in history. And I made them into boats. But again, it's like, and from objects, so high and low, a pre-Columbian figure that could belong in a museum. And the sails are, the sticks are made with chopsticks, and it's a little piece of drop cloth making the sail. And this is cornucopia. This is inspired in Colonial Mobile. Mobile is a tradition that was that existed before the Spanish arrived in Colombia and in Peru and Ecuador, and it was made of a resin. And when the Spanish arrived and they saw what was going on, it reminded them of Chinese lacquer, and they were already, when we think about globalization, we think of now, but Europe had a lot of trade with Asia, and they were bringing back to the Americas, they were bringing silk and Chinese lacquer and porcelain. And so they saw this, and they were, I mean, it didn't look like this, it looked more geometric. And they brought in, just as they brought images of virgins and copy this and copy that. So the resulting is a hybrid of that interaction between Spain and its colonies. And this is an example of Colonial Mobile. But what I'm really interested in is the part that is like, okay, where does that hybridity take place? Because I think that hybridity moves all the way to the present. And this is a European image. And if you see the border is indigenous. That geometry, that's native. And so you could say there's so many relationships here of oppression, but also of resistance. Because who was making these things? I think of that. Who made this? It was not a European, or maybe it was an artisan that was European and another one that was indigenous. So I started a series based on the Colonial Mobile. And I don't know if you saw the show at the Bemis called Monarchs. This piece is inspired in that, in those works that I've kind of like the lace. I look for them in books, in museums. I go to Colombia and I call colonial conservators and I say, can you show me, tell me, talk to me, explain. And so this is inspired in the Mobile. And that's the center panel. And again, it's using flowers as a feminine metaphor. Then the still life, which is in all of the, let's say, if we could, in the hierarchy of art, it's a little bit in the lower category in comparison to figure and the landscape. And I've placed some elements aside from the flowers, which are all researched. Some elements like drones and some kind of soldiers with guns, militia. On one side, these are the side panels. You have a landfill, and then a landscape. And a landscape that is inspired in indigenous imagery. These are more details. That's another version. That's 100 by 160. So they are all large scale. This is made on Tyvek, contemporary industrial materials, ink on Tyvek, scissors, glue. So each piece is cut and then pasted. Detail. So what I would like is for the work to be accessible. That it has an aspect that you can read clearly. Accessible emotionally, that yes, you can see maybe the history, but if you can't, then you see what's going on. So I've made a few of these. Now this is called Dream Map and Cornucopia. And what I did here, again, thinking of like that idea of the push and pull in an abstract expressionist painting. In the background, I placed an enlarged drawing of an Amazon mythical drawing. And in front, there's a cornucopia with images, flowers and images inspired in colonial painting. And this piece is 135 inches tall by 90. This was at the Union for Contemporary Art. This is a 60-foot drawing. And the lace is not done with a tiny little brush. It's more of a watery, so thinking of river. So I made formally, it was like, I can't have this be a tight drawing. How do I make it? It was a total learning experience, a little bit like the parrot. Like water, add water, water, water. No, this is hard, more water. So it was really interesting. And again, the shape of the quilt, the paper's folded like a quilt, and the lace becomes a landfill. The landscape turns into a landfill. Landfill / water flood. These are the pre-Columbian crisoles. This is the origin of, and I made these pieces, and I actually worked with my daughter. So she was smaller then. She was like, well, 2017. Younger. And she helped me make them. I started this piece when I arrived here. So it's been little by little, making the spoons, the little cups. But I was thinking of them as paintings. So they are made with something called paper clay, but they're all covered in caustic, in oil paint, like very thick. And they were placed like almost like museum samples. Now this is the last body of work that I've been working on, and this is inspired in a genre of painting that took place during the colony mostly in Spain and in Mexico. Mm-hmm. And so I decided to create my own version of casta paintings. So as you can see, they're usually 16, they're groupings of 16. So you have Español con India mestizo, mestizo con Española castizo, and so forth. And what I did was invite different Latina women to my studio, and I had them pose on the floor or a table, mostly on the floor, and I go around tracing them and then creating different drawings, different lines, and then filling them in, and then using flowers and a mask and a Spanish comb. India gentil, castiza, China, parda. And what I did, I wanted the pose to be like the pose that you take when you're going through a TSA machine when you're when you're in the airport. Which is that moment where you are held hostage. If you're told to give your phone, you do it, correct? It's that moment where you are powerless. But then again, I don't think of the figures as powerless. I think of them, so I think that's very much where my interest is. It's in that place, that push and pull between taking space and seeing where the space is being crushed, observing the oppression and the resistance. And of course, I'm thinking about this a great deal, given what we're going through in this country. These are all purchased. I've started with 2 masks that belonged to my mother. You know, she was an anthropologist, and 2 combs that she had that she used. I don't know if anybody here has had combs, Spanish combs, and that she probably would wear them in balls. Fiesta de baile, to assert your, your lineage back to Spain. Just like people say, go to St. Patrick's and wear a kilt, you know, rah rah, Ireland, you know? It's the same thing, it's that kind of, I go back to Spain. Which is also I think of it as like Latin America is pathologically obsessed with genealogy, because it's obsessed, in the end it's genealogy and last names, because in the end it's obsessed with class and race. And this is, I think, the last piece. This is the show that I'm having right now at UMOCA. But then again, these are thinking, this last piece of, I think there are a lot more similarities between the US, North America, and South America than we might want to even admit. And so when I'm putting this there, I'm not necessarily saying this is Colombia, this is Latin America. This is us, this is now, this is here. And that's it.
Many thanks, Nancy. Questions? We have time for questions now. Adrian, do you want to start?
Yes, please.
I'm wondering, how did you arrive to the conclusion to move to Nebraska?
Economic migration.
Well, I didn't know if you were, you mentioned Lincoln, and I didn't know if you were invited to be at UNL or.
No, my husband is from Lincoln. Yeah, my husband is from Lincoln, and New York was just getting more and more expensive, and it was, when you live in New York, you feel like you're in a very cool city and you have a very cool life, quote unquote, but then you're like struggling to make your work. So it was a decision. Okay, are we gonna be artists or are we gonna be New Yorkers? And we decided, we said, we're artists, let's go make our work. So my husband is from here, and there was a job opportunity, and we just ran with it. Yeah.
Nancy, I'm interested in how big these things are, and the space is as important as what you put on it, it seems to me.
Yeah.
And then not only that, but that they're black.
Yeah.
And I feel like I'm in a dream sometimes, dream state when I'm looking at some of your things. And it just really it's amazing to stand in front of it for a while. It does strange things, not strange, it just does something. It puts me in a different state a little bit. And not a dangerous or happy state, it's just a different. And you have a feeling about going big like that?
Well,
I mean-
I would go back to the first piece that I showed you, which is I always in the end, even though I might be talking about Spanish colonial history, or I want to have moments in the work where I feel suspended.
Oh. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that sometimes happens in a whole piece or in moments of a work. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
It's quite striking. Wow.
Adrian?
I'm curious about the suspended feeling that you're talking about, because I don't mean this like combatively at all, but it's just kind of an ambiguous phrasing. You know, suspended. Like, is that calming? Is it terrifying? Because I know, like, what Linda's getting at, one of the things about your work that I like is this push and pull, like, you know,
Yeah.
deep, empty space, and then this like really overloading quantity of visual information. You know, like it's like being manic and meditative at the same time. But you kept saying things like very minimal all throughout, making reference to minimals, and I was just curious, like, is there a maximalism that you
Yes.
You know, like the abundance of it's really not minimal in certain ways.
No, I think of the background as a kind of ideological dominant umbrella that where the work goes like this, goes all over. And that is, I'm thinking of the pieces by Richard Serra or Spanish colonial painting. That is, you know, it's extremely patriarchal. It comes from God. So maybe the suspension is in the making. It's that process. The process is super important. And I love arriving to that place where I'm in that kind of zone.
But it's kind of like a lush zone, right? It's not, you know, sometimes you talk to artists and they talk about that zone, it's frightening to them because it means that there's, you know, questions to be answered and chances to be taken and so forth. But you're describing it in this way that makes it sound really kind of lovely.
No, you know what? It's what you're saying. I find that sometimes a day at the studio, it's like when I have to leave, those last 20 minutes are really good. And it's always like, because yeah, there's a fear. Yeah, of course, it's kind of frightening. And that happens all the time. The studio is always like that. You know, you arrive, you make coffee, you check your phone, and it's always those last 20 minutes when you have to bolt out.
I want to ask, you know, I've been thinking the whole talk ever since you mentioned the gallery. It was the gallery owner who said he didn't like the title of the work.
Yeah.
It had the word, was it pleasure? Was it?
And of course I did it for pleasure.
Yes, of course I did it for pleasure. I mean, I look at these works and I think, okay, you've headed over the years towards some more overt political imagery, and we're not used to thinking, especially this week with all that we've been seeing with the Sam Nabaka exhibition, and then also some of the other presentations in the last week with this whole ArteLatinX exhibition. We're not used to thinking of political art as being so sensuous and lovely to look at, with flowers and birds I'm interested. I'm wondering what you think is the connection between the pleasure and the political. Maybe do you find a connection when you're trying to explore some of those themes? Your soldiers, your drones. Are they? Is it the pleasurable for you?
We had a little bit of a conversation. When I go to Colombia, Colombia has had a war of 60 years with a little truce there somewhere. And going there is always, and with its landscape, its relationships, it's very pleasurable and heartbreaking. And I think that I'd like to portray that, something that internally feels incredibly beautiful and heartbreaking. So maybe that's, but it's all, yeah, maybe. Maybe that's where some of it, does that answer? No.
There's no answer. There's no answer that's going to resolve anything for me. I just remember being struck when you showed the large work of Bemis, and just thinking, I couldn't stop, wandering across the surface of the canvas, looking at all the images and figures.
Here's something else.
And yet at the same time, you feel kind of like, I'm adoring all this, all the admixture of the pleasurable and then also the painful. Yeah.
Well, I sometimes look at political art and I think, God, maps of refugees and often they're very stark and I'm personally drawn to images that come from anonymous artists and artisans. The hand is there. I always think of those maybe as expressions of humanity, and I think the sensual is very important. To me it is. I'm not answering that question very cut and dry, sorry.
So I don't even know where I wanted to go with the question, really, except that it is this problem, seeing so much art that is disturbing to look at, and this is treading a different line here. Is trying to kind of find what's the pleasurable in something as just that it should just be distressing, like the pose that we adopted the TSA. Booth.
Or guys shooting at flowers. I mean, how
Right.
absurd is that?
Right. It sounds like the contemporary
Right.
problem.
Is it dystopian though? Because I know what you're saying that, when you're standing in front of the mirror, it's so much kind of fun to look at because there's all these marks and images coming out of images, and then the juxtapositions can be so kind of almost like looking at Bosch sometimes, where it's like these weird little vignettes.
Well, or it's the indulgence. It's a little bit the indulgence of all of this, and it's all of this other thing is happening in the back.
But are you an optimist?
No.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Well, when I saw your work and what he was describing as the, you know, it has an essence of beauty, but at the same time, you have soldiers and everything else, and it's political in an essence. I'm from Mexico, and when I go to Mexico at least twice a year, so I go there quite often. There are so many beautiful things, but you see all those beautiful things, and then you see the sprinkle of the bad.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's more than just a light sprinkle.
Yeah, it's a
You know,
lot.
you see the environmental things that are happening, you see the presence of soldiers, you see violence, you see a lot of things, but at the same time, you see flowers, you see culture, and you see wonderful people. So I can see how you integrate both the beauty and the political, because it is a vivid reflection of what's out there. They're both in the same spot, or in the same landscape per se.
Yeah, I think you're right.
And they both exist.
Which makes you an optimist, because the flower world is greater than the darkness resides within the darkness. Terrifying scenes emerge out of the darkness, whereas in the front present us. You drag us into this display of beauty and
Yeah.
flower. Something that really struck me during your talk was when you talked about sentimentality as something that wasn't American. Like it's anti-American United States to be sentimental. And that division I found quite intriguing. Is that part of sort of the identity of immigrating to the United States and feeling that maybe we come from romantic countries where we're allowed to be more sentimental, and then you get here
More
and you
sentimental, more, you talk about your problems with openly, like very quickly. You kind of like say, this is what's going on, da 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 da. Yeah, I mean, I think it's it is about that push and pull. So it's not only the pictorial push and pull, but the push and pull of culture, of language, of what. For me, as a person that has migrated, from Bogota to New York and then here, there's all of this negotiating on how to exist in every new society, and going back to Bogota, it's also, you go back and you're already a different person. So
Yeah, that,
I think that is reflects that. I mean, I think everybody here that
because you exist suspended in a void,
Yeah.
in a series of constructions of characters and identities that you don't really know how to resolve for yourself. And so that's where your work was fascinating, because you have these large voids, these spaces of reflection. And so when you're saying you've worked in silence when you're writing the word pieces, it really struck me. So it's like, how do you give voice to all those emotions when people around you refuse to be sentimental?
Yeah. Well, you do all of it. I mean, I think I've done all of it. I've kind of crouched in. Okay, I'm going to work in silence. Writing, it's non-comprehensible because it's basically unreadable. To a place of no, wait a second. What is this? How can I live the rest of my life like this? Trying to look like a New York artist when I'm not. So I think finding a voice is a long stretched. It's a journey.
I think your language also has a great influence. I mean, there are some things in Spanish and Brazilian language, Portuguese, that you can't really translate into English very good. I find it very difficult to use just the words.
Yeah.
Like if I'm in Mexico speaking Spanish for several days, I start thinking and seeing things differently
Yeah.
than I would in English. So I see that push and pull just in the words you use, and the language you use, and when you use it. You know, feminism just has all kinds of things into it, and you don't know where that person's looking at that. I
You
think that
know,
we do
that's
what we
the- I
do
mean-
because of the language. It just,
Yeah,
I'm sure you found it frustrating when you were learning a different language and can't remember, and you're trying to describe it or say something. I find that extremely frustrating. You know, or somebody tells, well, hurry up, what do you mean? Because language, I've learned, has different patterns. Like in English, you go straight to the point,
yeah,
where in Spanish, you kind of go this way and add this to get to that point.
but it's also the cultural impositions. For Latin American to arrive to a New York program, you are arriving to the dominant culture and to classes where there's no interest in discussing anything Latin American. What exists is the US and the New York school. And I think that goes all the way back to the colony. That goes into all of the interactions that we have in our spaces,
Wow.
and to the internalize and how you internalize those oppressions, those cultural oppressions.
Mm.
You know, when you
Yeah.
want to discuss, let's say, you know, there's this great, I mean, I remember at the time already Doris Salcedo was making great strides in the world. And who's Doris Salcedo? You know, let's talk about Jeff Koons. So I think all those things play into the building of an identity and of an expression, an artistic expression.
One of the first exhibits I ever had, somebody came up to me and said, "Oh, it sure doesn't look like Latin American art to me." And I said, "What do you mean?" "Well, it doesn't have a lot of color." You know, they were already defining the art, and I found it, I really wanted to slap him, you know. It was just as frustrating that you don't know what you're talking about. You don't know, to say that you don't know anything about Latin America, you know, my culture or anything, just because it doesn't meet your parameters. It really struck me really hard from then. So I do things sometimes just what people don't want or don't expect. You know, it's a rebellion. You know, I'm gonna be who I am, and do what I want, and show what I want, with no expectations.
Right, you can become a separatist, or
Yeah.
or you can join the dominant, or
Yeah.
or you can create a mix.
It changes you, that language changes you. And you know, that's why I think artist talks are so important, because of the words that you're using and the words that you select. They're just, really opens up a different way of looking at your work. You know, instead of just passing it, you have a different feel for it. And I appreciate that. Thank you, Nancy.
Thank you, guys.